Thank you for joining. I'm Mark Rozell, Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University. I'd like to welcome you to the March 2021 Race and Social Justice Colloquia, sponsored by the Schar School here at George Mason. And today's speaker is Professor Melvin Rogers, who is an associate professor of political science at Brown University. Dr. Rogers has a wide-ranging interest located largely within contemporary democratic theory and the history of American and African-American political and ethical philosophy. First book, The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy, explored these issues through an interpretation of John Dewey's writings and the theme of human responsiveness central to his work. That book was haunted by the unpursued theme of racial injustice and its place in American democracy. Professor Rogers' current book, The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African-American Political Thought, is devoted to figures within African-American and American political thought. It combines close readings of figures and historical contextualization to examine the themes of democratic responsiveness, redemption, and faith amid racial injustice. He has also edited John Dewey, The Public and Its Problems. His articles appear in major academic journals as well as popular venues such as Dissent, The Atlantic, Public Seminar, and the Boston Review. And he has just released the edited collection entitled African American Political Thought, A Collected History with the University of Chicago Press. And this is a collection of 30 essays on figures in the tradition of African American political thought. In addition to these past and current projects, Professor Rogers now serves as the co-editor of the Oxford University Press New Histories of Philosophy series. Today, he will discuss some concerns central to his current book project. Now, anytime we have remaining for questions, if Shar Miller agrees, Colloquium co-organizer Shar Miller will handle through the chat or according to the order you raise your hand emoji. So I'm going to rely on Shar to do that while I listen to the good discussion. So everybody join me in welcoming Professor Rogers to George Mason University and to the Schar School. Professor?
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank Char for the invitation. I want to thank Mark for those remarks. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to spend with me as I work through some ideas. So I know that this is a series dedicated to social justice, and of course, our present moment is saturated with issues requiring attention that relate to race and social justice. But I want to ask you if you'll be willing, and in some sense, invite you to journey with me back in time. And I want to go back to the 19th century, and I want us to reflect on together the theme of political pessimism was central to that period among African Americans, and in particular, two African American thinkers, the Black nationalists of the 19th century, Martin Delany, and that great abolitionist with which I suspect you are all familiar with, Frederick Douglass. So let's begin and let's see how far we get. So in Darkwater of 1920, W.B. Du Bois offers an incisive commentary on the meaning of democracy. And against those that would restrict the franchise, Du Bois writes the following: such arguments against the franchise show so curious a misapprehension of the foundation of the argument for democracy that the argument must be continually restated and emphasized. The argument for democracy must be continually restated, re-emphasized. And this statement, I think, is quite arresting given the historical setting. The words were penned by an African American in the 1920s at a time when the insecurity of Black life was constantly on display, a period in which, despite the Civil War amendments, Jim Crow was the law of the land and lynching was a daily reminder. of how easily one could be disposed of with impunity, and that the case for democracy must be continually restated and reemphasized amid what I gather was its distorted expression, raises an important question that haunts the struggle for racial equality and indeed the legitimacy of the American polity. And here is the question: what is it about democracy that justifies our faith, especially the faith of African Americans in it? Given the frequency with which African Americans are killed by police, the ongoing problems of economic inequality they experience, and the general sense that from city to city, state to state, Black people are subject to a fundamental insecurity not chiefly of their own making, it is difficult to suggest that commitment is or has been justified at all. Here, of course, you should note I'm focusing exclusively on the Black-white paradigm, but as we know, racial discrimination is not confined to Black people. Now, it may seem more appropriate to interpret the United States as working according to plan when Black people sort of experience racial disregard. And it may be more appropriate to connect the horror of the earliest periods of African American life in this country to the present moment, and to do that and to engage in that connection in one long story about the nation's presumed foundational commitment to anti-Blackness. It may seem appropriate to do that. Writing, for example, in response to the 2012 killing of Trayvon Martin, journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates describes Martin's killing as the natural consequence of the proper functioning of American society. These are his words from 2012, 2013, quote, "When you have a society that takes at its founding the hatred and degradation of a people, when the society inscribes that degradation in its hollow documents and continues to inscribe hatred in its laws and policies, it is fantastic to believe that its citizens will derive no ill messaging. It is painful to say Trayvon Martin is not a miscarriage of justice, but American justice itself. This is not our system malfunctioning. It is our system working as intended." Little can be denied in this, and we might add other voices who are trying to get us to see that anti-Blackness functions as, in many instances, a precondition for American progress, a kind of provocative statement. As philosopher Calvin Warren tells us, quote, "It is the humiliated, incarcerated, mutilated, and terrorized Black body that serves as the vestibule for the democracy to come," end quote. Warren stands in a tradition of thinking known as Afro-pessimism that includes scholars such as Jared Sexton and Frank Wilderson, and all of them view the persistent racial inequality and the vulnerability that Black people experience as the inescapable afterlife of slavery. Slavery continues to live on. This is its ghostly after effect, they want to say. And this has really led, as Juliet Hooker and Barnard Hess tell us, to a fundamental conundrum in African American politics. Quote, "One of the fundamental paradoxes of Black politics is the invariable futility of directing activism toward a racially governing regime historically founded on the constitutive exclusion and violation of Blackness." Now, it is fashionable these days, and I know, and understandably so, to wear one's despair on one's sleeve. And if we're honest with ourselves, how could we do otherwise? Moments of hope have often been dashed by the cold and cruel reality of American life. And it is no wonder we find it hard to stabilize our faith in a racially just society. I mean, here in brief is a sample of this history. In the wake of Black Americans' participation in the American Revolution, the nation witnessed a slow denial of their standing and contribution to the polity. With the ongoing development of slavery in the South, northern states in the 19th century slowly rescinded rights that had previously been extended to African Americans. Now, although the Civil War amendments sought to recognize the equal status of African Americans, that recognition was effectively denied by the ascendancy of debt peonage, economic exploitation, lynching, and of course, as I've already mentioned, Jim Crow. The civil rights movement, you might say, killed Jim Crow, but the policing and subordination of Black people was reconstituted through the rise of the carceral state, the underdeveloped welfare state, and the underfunded public education system that has exacerbated or been exacerbated by residential segregation. Whatever one might think of his success, the fact remains is that the election of the first Black president was followed by Donald Trump, who, as you will recall, defined his success based on removing any trace of its previous occupant. Trump's success was, without exaggeration, cultivated through the tropes of white supremacy, nativism, and the commitment to police Black and brown populations. At precisely this moment, with this kind of narration that I just laid out for you, a pretty dramatic one, I think, at precisely this moment, we need to ask some important questions. Is American democracy constitutionally at odds with our goals, or might it be conducive to building a society in which we all can live equally and at peace with one another? Are there normative resources on which one can rely to advance affirmative claims regarding racial equality, resources that are distilled not by denying the story that I just outlined, but by disclosing its competing vision? So I'm suggesting that there's another story to be told that competes with the one that I've just laid out. Or must the resources of modern democracy remain forever premised, as some argue, on anti-Blackness? Now, admittedly, these appear to be empirical questions. They appear to depend on history, but do they? We might say it this way. In our historical calculus, we might emphasize the reconstitution of white supremacy, but we could just as easily emphasize the ways in which it has been foiled through multiple waves of racial inclusion. Now, those who embrace the former as our true racial reality find themselves trying to convince or to prove to those of us who have benefited from racial struggle why our success is illusory or at best temporary. So those who want to say that sort of fundamentally that America, the United States, is fundamentally anti-Black, they have this problem of trying to prove to those who have benefited from racial struggle why really we should buy into that story. But those who locate America's identity in its resistance to white supremacy have, I think, another problem. They are often unable to see the evidence of systemic racism, or they readily describe racism as anomalous, foreign to the structure of our institutions and culture. If the first posture seems unsatisfying because it denies human agency and gives the past too much power over the present and future, the second really risks turning a blind eye to the ways white supremacy is often bolstered by institutional support and state-sanctioned violence that emanate, frankly, from a culture that disregards Black people. Both sides, it seems to me, fail to distinguish between the somewhat different task of studying the past and narrativizing the past in a way that is useful for moving us forward, moving society in an auspicious direction. In Frederick Douglass's felicitous formulation of the matter, we have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future. These words that I just cited come from Frederick Douglass's 1852 address, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And in that address, many of you may be familiar with it, in that address, Douglass does not dismiss the past. Rather, he stands in a line of thinkers who see in America's past a vital principle that is both visionary and realistic. Similar to earlier 19th century abolitionists, say David Walker, well before Douglass, and someone like James Baldwin well after, Douglass deploys the principle of making and remaking that underwrites the American polity, what we political theorists call the constituent power of the people. and his argument about the constituent power of the people, the ability to make and remake society, is taken to be central to the very functioning of democratic life. The idea of the people, Douglas knows all too well, forms part of the tradition of American life, sitting alongside and often used to combat the white supremacist tendencies of the American polity. And Douglas retrieves this principle, that is to say, the ability of the people to make and remake themselves. He retrieves this principle from the past, and he counsels his fellows to put it in the service of the present and the future. For Douglas, African Americans may often be alienated from the American polity, but they are not alien to it. And this point is of great significance when you consider the thread running through much of African American thinking and struggle that seeks to make America, the United States, a racially just society. They see their efforts, African Americans that is, they see their efforts as emerging from within and forming part of the very complex tradition of America's moral and political language. And like them, Douglas aims to emphasize those portions of that tradition that might yet deepen and extend democracy against those portions that would constrain democracy's meaning and reach. So the meaning of America, the United States, its past and its future, is for Douglas something over which to struggle. But he sees struggle as an emergent property or an emergent feature, really, of the contested notion of who comprises the people that is central, that is otherwise central to democracy's self-understanding. So who really belongs to this polity is taken to be a contested feature of what it means to live in this polity. The question of what America really is then defies articulation, even as we struggle to say something substantive about our ethical and political identity. And this is simply because we cannot get on with figuring out where we should go and who we ought to be without narrating the past to which we belong, but worrying too much about offering the true description or final narrative of that past may miss the point. We ask questions of the past: who are we really? Less to understand our identity once and for all, and more to aid us in making decisions and choices about who we should become. This, I want to submit to you, is the aspirational quality of the American imagination, indeed the aspirational core on which African Americans have often relied to make sense of their appeals to the nation. This is, I believe, to put it in a different way, the sort of perfectionist or romantic register on which many in this tradition have often worked, including Douglas himself. And I want to spend now the rest of the time trying to retrieve the meaning and complex power of this account, believing that it is during moments of dark times, such as our current moment, that we need to recall the faith of those that came before. You'll see me glance down every now and again. I'm just checking my time. Now, just as we have in our current moment powerful reasons to lose faith and powerful reasons to believe in what the Afro-pessimists, the earlier group of figures I named, what the Afro-pessimists offer us, Douglas had in his own time a powerful alternative vision confronting his own. And it is with that vision, the vision of Martin Delany, with which we begin. So here is the story. On the evening of December 13th, 1850, the faculty of the Harvard Medical School met at the house of then Dean Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr., to discuss various petitions regarding the admission of 3 African Americans and 1 woman to the school. Now, although Holmes, who was the dean, had already granted admission to the students and the men were already in attendance on lectures, the woman had withdrawn before she started, it was ultimately deemed, quote, inexpedient after the present course to admit colored students to attendance on medical lectures, end quote. Now, explaining his position, Holmes said in a letter of 1850, the faculty is now convinced quote, that the intermixing of the white and black races in their lecture rooms is distasteful to a large portion of the class and injurious to the interests of the school, end quote. Now, Holmes was expressing and affirming views articulated in the earlier resolution passed by a majority of the students. And I won't give you all of this resolution, but I'll give you just a piece. Whereas blacks have been admitted to the lectures of the medical department of Harvard University, therefore resolved, this is the second resolve, that we cannot consent to be identified as fellow students with blacks whose company we would not keep in the streets and whose society as associates we would not tolerate in our homes. The first resolve was about having black people in attendance. The effect of that is to lessen the quality of the degree. Martin Delany, one of the 4 admitted students, left Harvard Medical School in March of 1851. He was not permitted to return. Only a few months earlier, in September of 1850, the United States Congress passed the draconian Fugitive Slave Law, an act that strengthened the earlier Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And in response to the 1793 version, states such as Indiana and Connecticut made the right of jury trial upon appeal possible for escaped slaves, while states such as Vermont and New York provided escaped slaves with attorneys, as well as making the jury trial a legal right. The 1850 version of the Fugitive Slave Law destroyed all such possibilities. It corrected essentially what was considered to be the loopholes. And in correcting all such loopholes, it effectively denied the standing of slaves even in free states, while also adding harsh penalties for those who either failed to enforce the law or who helped slaves to escape. Now, in Delany's mind, these two mingled. His mission was rescinded, and he has the Fugitive Slave Law. It is circulating in the newspapers. These two mingled in his mind. They each were a piece of a general logic of seeing African Americans as an inferior race. In response, Delany argues for immigration. It's time to go. That's the argument he makes. In his signature text, The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States, published in April of 1852, this text represents a powerful indictment of American life. Delany's argument for immigration emanates from a belief that the ethos, the culture of the polity, depends on the domination of Black Americans, depends on the domination. The culture depends on the domination of Black Americans. Think about those earlier quotes that I gave you at the outset from contemporary thinkers. That anti-Blackness or that democracy's progress is dependent on anti-Blackness. So this is what Delany says, quote, "We are politically not of them, but aliens to the laws and political privileges of this country. These are truths, fixed facts that quaint theory and exhausted moralizing fall harmlessly before," end quote. But there's something else at work in Delany's extraordinary text of 1852. Political life, he thinks, is merely the attitudinal expression of the underlying culture of the people. Here's a quote. Listen, let's listen together. "Although the whites, their color is made by law and custom, the mark of distinction and superiority, while the color of the blacks is a badge of degradation acknowledged by statute, organic law, and the common consent of the people. With this view of the case, which we hold to be correct, to elevate to equality the degraded subject of law and custom," here he's referring to Black people, "it can only be done by an entire destruction of the identity of the former condition of the applicant." Now, by the destruction of the identity, by identity here, Delany has in mind the identity that is ascribed to African Americans by virtue of their race, what he is calling the badge of degradation that is instantiated, he says, acknowledged by the political, legal, and cultural life of American society. The identity of white Americans, he wants you to believe, partly comes about by virtue of this contrast with their darker counterparts. To overcome this condition requires that one destroy the badge of degradation, but this also involves significantly, he argues, a willingness by white Americans to destroy the legal and customary badge of superiority they now flaunt. They must be willing, in other words, to destroy who they take themselves to be. And this would mean, in Delaney's mind, the overthrow of the American polity. Now, Delaney connects ethos or culture and politics together in a way that continues, I think, to haunt us today. He wants us to think that there is no meaningful distinction between, remember, the constituent power of the American people, and we can now call it its constituted form, right? So the form of government that emerges from that constituent power of making and remaking. He wants us to say there's no distinction between the two. And he wants us to believe that the people's cultural identity and its political identity cannot be separated or transformed, even as the latter, the political identity, ought to be understood as the means by which the former is politically consolidated. Now, this is a bit of vocabulary here that I've been using from political philosophy, but most of us will, I think, once we get past the language, recognize its meaning. Constituent power, the power of the people, is the power for making and remaking society. The constituted expression, as I said a moment ago, the government and its institutions, derives its existence from this power. It forms the channel through which the agency of the people moves. This is how it is typically understood. Constituent power functions as a kind of independent or autonomous domain that can be inhabited by anyone. Any one of us can deploy constituent power. And since it is a domain that is not identified with government, the idea is that constituent power, the space of constituent power, can never finally be colonized by any one voice. The constituent power of the people seemingly stands apart from constituted power, giving constituted power direction, all the while preventing constituted power from finally speaking in the name of one group or one person. And one way to think about this is that when you think about our sort of representative system, a representative system is structured to reflect the interests of it, right? But the constituency, the thought is that the constituency is never finally settled. That space is a space of dynamism. And so whatever is done in the name of the constituents, right, should never be understood as the sort of final statement, because there's still all this dynamism taking place over here. Now, for Delaney, the identity of the American people really has no distinct or prior political existence. So this business of constituent power being a separate domain doesn't make sense to him. The political harmony of society is found in the harmony of a constitutional order. The constitutional order essentially is the material expression, it is the institutional expression of the cultural life of society. This way of proceeding is what allows Delaney in 1852 to view the Fugitive Slave Act as he does, and is what allows Coates, if you think back to 2012, from the quote that I cited earlier, to say that Trayvon Martin is not a miscarriage of justice, but American justice itself. This is not our system malfunctioning, it is our system working as intended. Now, Delaney's view opened, I think, an important disagreement between him and Frederick Douglass that we want to pay attention to at this moment. And here is what Delaney says of his position to William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, in 1852. And then I'm going to contrast this with the statement by Douglass. And we begin to see a tension between the two. So here's Delaney first, 1852. I'm not in favor of caste, nor a separation of the brotherhood of mankind, and would as willingly live among white men as blacks if I had equal possession and enjoyment of privileges. Here is the move. Blind selfishness on the one hand and deep prejudice on the other will not permit them to understand that we desire the exercise and enjoyment of rights. If there were any probability, I should be willing to remain in this country, fighting and struggling on, but I must admit that I have no hopes in this country, no confidence in the American people, with a few excellent exceptions. Therefore, I have written as I have done. Here is Douglas' response a year later to this sentiment. We don't object to colonizationists because they desired the prosperity of Liberia. This was one of the plans to where Black people would go. But it is because, like Brother Delaney, they have not sufficient faith in the people of the United States to believe that the Black man can ever get justice at their hands on American soil. We have probability and hope in the language of Delaney. We have the language of faith in Douglas. And I want to play around with these two words, the slide from hope to faith. The second description I want to play around with bears on the invocation of the people that is found in Douglas's passage that I just cited. So let's deal with this slide from hope to faith first, and then I'll take up the language of the people, and then we'll sort of wrap up why this matters. So the language of hope and faith they're not synonyms. Hope, as Patrick Shade notes, is a, quote, active commitment to the desirability and realizability of a certain end, end quote. It appears for Delaney that hope is tied to confidence in bringing to fruition what one desires. As he suggests, hope stands within the world of probabilities informed by facts that provide indications of what is possible. We must abandon, Delaney says, all vague theory and look at facts as they really are, viewing ourselves in our true condition in the body politic. But he takes those facts, at least in 1852, to be exhaustive, not only of what is, but what may be. In contrast now to hope, faith is, as we will see in a moment, a passionate conviction that is sort of coterminous with a vision of life or object that is not in existence. Now notice here that both hope and faith are tied to something not yet in existence, but the source of difference between the two is that hope marks levels of confidence in achieving what is desired, while faith is the expression of a love and even a difficult commitment precisely because there is no confidence to be had, at least based on some facts of the matter, in its realization. This at least appears to be one take on how these things fit together. Delaney not only dispenses with hope because there is no evidence to sustain it, but more significantly, he is without faith because he does not believe, right, that there is a narrative of American or African-American life that can provoke whites to change, to dispense with the status they seemingly enjoy by virtue of being white. In contrast, all Douglas has, in one sense, is faith. In his 1852 address, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, the famous address, right, to which I've already referred, everyone wants to go to, we'll do it right now. Douglas holds fast to the idea that he can put the revolutionary spirit of 1776 in the service of a racially just society. And he thinks that he could put it in the service of a racially just society that has never before existed. He thinks that inhabiting the revolutionary spirit and putting it in the service of a racially just society will be so compelling that his fellows will want to take it up. And he holds fast to this claim that they will want to take it up, even as he says the following, quote, America is false to the past, false to the present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future. Now, this declaration that I just cited should not be taken too far, since the rhetorical context is that Douglas often declares things to be the case as a means to stimulate an alternative option. But still he says this. He falls to the future. Now, admittedly, sometimes it is Douglas's religious commitments at work informing his faith. Writing in the wake of the Dred Scott decision, he tells us that Justice Taney, quote, may decide and decide again, but he cannot reverse the decision of the Most High. He cannot change the essential nature of things, making evil good and good evil. Other times it is Douglas's vision of human nature that underwrites his faith. While man is constantly liable to do evil, he tells us in 1851, he is still capable of apprehending and pursuing that which is good. But more consistently, I think it is faith in a specific idea of America. Whatever is hoped for seems to have no other ground than this idea itself. Returning to the 4th of July address, he writes, I therefore leave off where I began, with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains. And he repeats the sentiment in the Dred Scott speech of 1857. For Douglass, hope and faith come together in a way similar to Hebrew 11:1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. How then ought we to think about faith? As I read him, Douglass's account of faith is tantamount, and this is crucial, it is tantamount to a vision of political and ethical life that is at variance, at odds with the community he inhabits, what America fails to be true to. And insofar as that variance with the community that he inhabits, it is a vision, right? It is a vision that he hopes will command allegiance precisely because he believes it ought to guide our lives and for which he and others should be willing to fight to bring into existence. Now, this view, this idea that faith is about a vision that is at odds with society, that one thinks can command the allegiance of others and for which people will be willing to fight, this view marks an important difference between Delany and Douglass. And I think between those who are pessimists regarding racial transformation and those who are keepers of the faith. Delany treats the facts of racial domination as capturing the way the world as it really is and as it really is in itself. This is what this society is from beginning to end. He thinks those facts are expressive of a deeper historical logic that is merely playing itself out in the United States. As he writes in Condition, quote, that there have been in all ages and in all countries classes of people who have been deprived of equal privileges. These are historical facts that cannot be controverted. Now take note here, Delany does not merely provide us with a description of the past in his invocation of historical facts. Rather, he's doing something quite sophisticated here and subtle, but important to observe. He is subsuming history under the category of nature itself. And when he does that, he essentially, and here is a philosophical term, he essentially ontologizes history as the ultimate ground of human existence. The facts cannot be controverted. Here now we're going to unpack this. The facts cannot be controverted because they define the temporal fields of the past, present, and future. And just as Delany ontologizes history, we see a similar move in someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates in Our Present Moment. Writing In Between the World and Me of 2015, Coates argues that white supremacy is, here are the words, a force of nature, end quote. And then on the heels of that claim reminds us that we, Black Americans, quote, are the helpless agents of the world's physical laws. So much for human agency. Delany is already doing this in 1852. Douglass rejects this kind of thinking. He refuses to remove the human element from the facts of American history, and he thinks that since the human element isn't the kind of thing that is fixed once and for all, there's no reason to think that the future need only be a replication of the past. To recall a line cited from his 1851 essay, Is Government Right? Quote, and you will remember this, while man is constantly liable to do evil, he is still capable of apprehending and pursuing that which is good, end quote. Now, I often think, here I will introduce very briefly another figure. I often think of the African-American thinker of the sort of late 19th century into the 20th century, Anna Julia Cooper, and then this sort of other, what we might call the other American pragmatists, figures like William James and John Dewey. I often think of them when I read Douglass because I see them as defending a similar kind of faith and holding the view that human beings are unfinished creatures. And the importance of this faith is heightened in dark political times and explains why Douglass's why Douglas's faith remains, I think, important for us today. Anna Julia Cooper famously tells us that faith is neither a proper interpretation of scripture nor a process of stabilizing theological certainties. She was religious, but she was uninterested, in having the logic of her faith confined to religion. As she argues in A Voice from the South of 1892, very important work, faith involves submitting oneself to a vision of life that one projects into a world at odds with that vision and for which one is willing to act in the service of. And of course, we hear the echo of this position in William James of 1897. In his account, faith need not be at odds with the world, but its end in no way is assured. These are William James's words. Faith is the readiness to act in the service of a cause, the prosperous issue of which is not certified to us in advance. I mean, this is why John Dewey, for example, insisted that there is a difference between, quote, belief that is a conviction that some end should be supreme over conduct, and belief that some object exists as truth for the intellect. And by this, Dewey explicitly intended, and this is what Douglas had in mind, Dewey explicitly intended to treat certain kinds of beliefs as imaginative possibilities that political actors believe ought to organize their lives and the lives of others. Imaginative possibilities in which they invest their energies. But in seeking to convert one's faith into a matter of intellectual assent, a feature of political reality here and now, think of Delaney or Coates, we often reject faith as a precondition for political engagement in the first place. And thinking about faith in this way, I do not mean to suggest that faith isn't disciplined and it isn't humbled. I don't mean to suggest you can think whatever you like. Faith talk is often assumed to be a species of irrational thinking. But I tend to think this way of understanding the matter is mistaken, precisely because it does not take seriously how faith is often disciplined. It is disciplined because the vision of life faith holders offer is often distilled from the bits and pieces of the social and political community's language and reality that is then reconfigured, unified, and projected forward into a novel pattern of life, a pattern that does not yet exist. African-American thinkers and activists, it seemed to me, who stand with Douglas often organize the language of struggle and appeal in such a way to disclose new meanings regarding its reach. They have reworked, for example, the interior logic of freedom so that it did not merely mean, it did not merely denote a political standing that one has, think, for example, of the American colonists, but that it also meant that denial of the very idea, right, that the very meaning of freedom, right, was something that one could have independent of constitutional affirmation. And this enabled some to see that addressing the condition of Black people in the United States would take more than legal and political changes, but a deep transformation of culture in which negative and debilitating images of Black people and their capacities circulated. You see this, for example, in Ida B. Wells. You see it in famously in David Walker. Let me try to bring this to a close. Now, although the imagination is at work among these faith holders, the resources of the imagination are not imaginary. So to stick with the examples, to use some examples, we can see in the 19th century that someone like David Walker wanted us to understand that freedom was a function of being able to judge the world in which you live, not a function of constitutional endorsement. Very different account of freedom. Think, for example, of Martin Luther King's famous deployment of the founders in his great speech, the I Have a Dream speech, right? Where somehow Black people turned out to be the heirs of what the founders had laid out. Well, we know historically that that's not right. So then what is King doing? How is he reconfiguring, right, the bits and pieces of America's past and their mythos? Well, he knows that we have a love affair with the founders. And if we come to think that we're out of sorts with the founders, out of step with them, right, then we will work hard to get rightly aligned with them. Well, what will we work hard to get rightly aligned with? Well, King will give you that vision, a racially just society. Faith in this regard is a reality for faith holders, for it orients them in space and moves them through time, influencing their ethical and political choices. And this is why famously Ralph Waldo Emerson tells us that faith makes us, not we it, and faith makes its own forms. Faith holders only long for the rest of their fellows to see its worth, its significance, and its contribution to human flourishing. But the actions of the faith holders are also humbled by the fact that what they offer is dependent on those over whom they do not control and yet on whose actions they depend. This is partly why Douglass worked so hard in the 4th of July address to shame and ridicule his audience, attempting to move them to a position of moral rectitude. And this is why King often uses America's love affair with the founders as a way of eliciting from them something that the founders never intended or imagined. If we centralize dependence on our fellows and take seriously the absence of control, faith always bespeaks the uncertainty that saturates human experience. Uncertainty determines not merely the origin, but more critically the career of what is longed for, what we desire, love, and value. Faith thus involves a mixture of confidence that encourages self-assertion, yet sensitivity to uncertainty that demands humility. So let me just sort of conclude. On a final note, because I know we're at time. When Delaney decides in 1852 to collapse constituent power and constituted power, he misses something that Douglass is trying to retrieve. That the space of constituent power is a space of openness and contestation. It may be violent, but it is a space of openness and contestation. And that, in fact, that this is the condition of democratic legitimacy, right? So in electoral terms, right, sometimes you lose, but the reason why you remain committed is because you know that there may be some future time potentially in which you might win. That is sort of based on this logic of constituent power. This emphasis on remaking, reinventing, and openness that is at the heart of constituent power, and remaking and reinventing in the service of the future that I have emphasized in Douglass, may give the impression that he means for us to turn away from the past. And if I've given you that mistake, and that is a mistake, I mean, he agonizes over the past and he struggles with the past, but the aim is to put the past in the service of the future. We struggle to live together as democratic citizens because we have not always understood the art, I think, of allowing portions of ourselves to die, allow portions of ourselves to go away. When Douglass, and now we can include just very briefly another figure, James Baldwin, what Douglass and James Baldwin share is the belief that a democratic society is partly measured by the ability of its citizens to let go of their former selves as they quest after selves that are larger, more capacious, and inclusive. This is what constituent power makes possible. And we hear from all corners that the sun is setting on the American empire. This is as it should be. Every empire that has existed has left death and destruction in its wake. What we must ask ourselves now, the question that Douglass put to his fellows in his day, is what in our past might we retrieve for our present? How might those resources be reimagined to articulate a political faith more human and just than the reality we find ourselves living? And how might we engage in what constituent power makes possible? How might we allow portions of ourselves to die with grace so that we might live and grow with dignity? But answering this question requires us to begin as Douglass did, and not as Delaney did, but as Douglass did, with the idea that who we are as Americans need not determine who we may become. So I'll stop there. I know we got some people that dropped off. I went on a little too long, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Melvin. So I'm going to turn it over to colleague Shar Miller, who will run the question and answer session. Shar?
Great. Great. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, Professor Rogers. That was really fabulous. I really enjoyed it. The first question we have on the table is from Jerry, and I think you can see it in your question and answer box as well as I can. And great presentation. Love the use of Douglass. The quote about using the past, though, raises for me Nietzsche's essay on the uses and abuses of history for life. The very forgetful nation of America surely needs more memory of its racist past than it has currently. But is there a danger, either for the nation or for Black nationalism, in the past becoming, in Nietzsche's words, the gravedigger of the present, when it becomes so omnipresent that it cripples us into immobility? How do we know when the past has ceased to be useful?
Oh boy, was
That
Jerry?
was
Is
an
this
easy
from
question.
Jerry? Where's Jerry, boy? That's a heavy question. So of course, in that wonderful essay from Nietzsche, right? Part of what Nietzsche is suggesting there, if we can go there for a moment, is that we don't want to sort of live minutely in the past. We're historical creatures, but we don't want to live minutely in a meditation on the past, because if we do, then we will find ourselves drowning in the past, right? But of course, and of course, this is sort of a fine line as a danger. But of course, we want to know, as James Baldwin would emphasize, we want to have a clear sense of that which has given life to the present. And the way we sort of manage this divide between the kind of between the worry about drowning in the past and Baldwin's sense and Douglas's sense that we need to be attentive to it, right, is we manage it through the problems that continue to organize and structure our lives. The problems are actually what discipline, right, the level of attention that is paid to, that is given to the past. Now, if that's the case, then the question that we have to ask is, how might our society currently resemble features of our racial past? How might the lives that we live now bear the mark of that racial past, right? So the problems that we find ourselves confronting in terms of racial inequality, the persistence of white supremacy, this is the past speaking into the present. And what someone like Baldwin and Douglas wanted us to do is to measure the meaning of our society, or to measure the value of our society as a democratic society, by the extent to which we become responsive, attentive to that past as disciplined by the problems that continue to plague us today. This, I think, or this is what Baldwin and Douglas thought before him, this is sort of how we manage not being drowned by the past, because ultimately what one means to do is to release agency, right? To sort of produce a kind of flourishing. It is a dangerous affair, right? It is a dangerous affair, but haven't we had so much preoccupation, right? With thinking that there is no past for us to attend to, right?
Great. Anybody else have any questions? You can raise your hand, your emoji hand, or drop into the questions and answers. I have a kind of quick question, not a quick question, I guess, but the kind of, I mean, this was the title, or our initial orientation of the talk was around questions of pessimism. And I mean, nature comes to function as a kind of pessimistic orientation here. And so I was kind of curious, like, could you read Douglas more pessimistically, though? I mean, does hope have to count on a positive return? Can you be, are there sort of ways to loosen that connection, right? Where pessimism doesn't just immediately lead to kind of the inaction of Delaney, where he's going to leave and kind of stop messing with it. Or could you imagine a kind of political orientation, which is also pessimistic, like isn't treating, is kind of more in line with faith than hope, I guess, in your category, where hope sort of has an expectation of possibilities. So perhaps non-pessimistic. Whereas, and I really like this part where, faith doesn't really require that so much. But so I guess, could you have kind of faith that's pessimistic?
So I think that this goes back to Jerry's question, because the sort of aim of, so I introduced James Baldwin, could introduce some other figures, Ida B. Wells, for example, and her sort of deep and profound concern with the practice of lynching. but not just simply with sort of the practice of lynching, but behind that, what she calls the unwritten laws that police the boundaries between Blacks and whites. All of these figures are very much attentive to the ways in which a kind of benefit redounds to whiteness, not the same benefit across the board, but in the sense that there's a way in which one's white counterparts are not exposed to arbitrary violence. They are very much sensitive to this, and this sort of structures their constant concern. You see it in Douglass, you see it in Ida B. Wells, you see it in Anna Julia Cooper, you see it in James Baldwin, that constant attentiveness to be mindful of the past. What emerges from this view then, if you take it seriously, is that what they really are inviting us to do, and it comes to a head in James Baldwin, is actually to dispense with our preoccupation with redemption. Let's disentangle our concern with progress from redemption. And when we disentangle our preoccupation of progress and redemption, when we sort of disentangle these things, one of the things that we will find ourselves doing is treating progress or measuring progress by virtue of our attentiveness and sensitivity to the ongoing workings of racial disregard. And on that account, then, it suggests that for Douglass, I mean, Douglass by the end of his life was most certainly thinking this, for Douglass, for Ida B. Wells, for James Baldwin, in some ways, the deed of white supremacy and the horror it has created has been done. The sort of scar it has been left, and there we have it. What they want to resist, of course, is this other implication, that because one takes seriously the scar, it therefore means one must pull away from politics. One must divest from trying to transform society.
I see Jerry's back for more clarification. I get you. If you're right that the pessimism of the 19th century Black philosophers descends down to Coates, and I think you are absolutely right, do you see Obama as the avatar of optimism for Black hopes? Or is that a false dichotomy because Obama is merely being hopeful as a political posture of necessity?
Well, I think that once we begin to talk about Obama, we move into very difficult and uncertain waters. Why difficult and uncertain waters? Well, because unlike all of the figures that I've just named, Obama moves or has moved, continues to move in the beltway of American politics. And as we know from James Baldwin, to borrow the title of his book, to borrow the title of Fred Harris' book, there's a price to the ticket. And so Obama's language of Obama's deployment of hope, his language of optimism, I think is often colored by the disciplinary techniques of American politics. Now, having said that, there's a way in which, so I'll use a couple of examples, Obama's constant criticism when he engaged in critique of the Black community, and his kind of criticism of the sort of culture of Black life, mostly focusing on Black men, always takes place without including, as these other figures did, without including the sort of wider context of choice. And the wider context of choice, of course, is a context of systemic racism and the persistence of white supremacy. And insofar as Obama lets that go, he makes it appear as if only these Black men will comport themselves in the right way, they would be able to flourish. I mean, this is the kind of optimism that is deeply troubling, and it's the kind of optimism that is born from the alliance between progress and redemption, right? It leads you to believe, it leads you, or you fail to attend to the ways in which the past continues to extend into the present, structuring the life chances of Black people, not in the same way, and not precisely. There are differences. There is progress, right? But to sort of say, but to suggest that we're sort of a redeemed people is a mistake, and in context where he, and I'll stop on this point, and in context where he only levels the critique against Black men, just to use that example, it is as if the doors are completely open. You need only to straighten up and walk through them the right way. Right? That's a mistake.
Right, well, we've come up to 1 o'clock, Shar, so I want to say thank you to Shar and Connie McNeely, the co-organizers of this session, to colleagues and staff who came today. It was a really good talk. I learned a lot, Melvin. Thank you so much. I hope you'll keep in touch with us. I guess you know Jerry Mayer. You talk like you're friends or something.
I do know, yeah.
You know Jerry, all right. So he's trouble. Well, Melvin, thank you very much. And I sincerely mean it. I hope we all keep in touch with each other. And this is just not a one-time opportunity to get to know each other better, okay?
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank
All right.
all of those who attended.
All right, thank you all. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Melvin. Have a great afternoon. Good to see you.
Thank you.